Well, good morning. This is Barry Odell with the Church of Christ at Mammoth Spring Facebook page. Hope everybody's doing well today. It is Thursday morning, April 15th, 2021. We got several on the live stream already. Good morning, Diana, Jennifer, Brian, Gail, Linda, and Lyle, and others that may be watching out there that don't comment. That's okay. Glad that you're here today. We are ready for Romans chapter 13 today. Romans chapter 13. Being Thursday, of course, this will be the last stream of this week. And hope everybody has a good weekend. We are ready for Romans 13. Again, these are the fundamentals of Christianity, beginning in chapter 12. As I said yesterday, there are fundamentals throughout the rest of the book of Romans, but when you hit chapter 12, man, it gets right down to everyday Christianity. Very fundamental stuff. So that's what we're going to pay attention to today here. Only 14 verses. So it's not technically a very long chapter, but there's a lot in here. So let's get started. The first two verses. What we're dealing with in this chapter is the Christian's relation to government. The Christian's relation, as the New King James says, to the governing authorities. So first two verses, you are either subject or you are resistant. One of those two. So I want to point some things out as I go along here, as I'm reading. Let every soul, I've got every soul circled in my Bible. This is a universal command. What is the command? Be subject to the governing authorities. The word subject in the Greek language comes from a word, hupotasso, that means to place under. Okay, so let every soul place himself under the governing authorities. Hey, Barry and Glenda and Anna and Connie, glad to see all of you joining on this morning. It's universal, and we are to place ourselves under the governing authorities. Why? For there is no authority except from God. That is the origin. He is the source of civil society. All right? He is the source of, I guess we could say, law and order. And the authorities that exist are appointed by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authority, again, that's a universal term, whoever, resists the authority, resists the ordinance of God, and those who resist will bring judgment on themselves. Listen to that. Hey, Miss Louise, and good morning, Derek. If you resist the governing authorities, you will bring judgment upon yourself. Now, it's our country right now, and for the last couple of years, there's always been rebellion. The United States of America was founded upon the concept of rebellion. We understand that. The Revolutionary War. All right, we get that. That doesn't change what Romans 13 says. All right, right now in our country, and again for the past couple of years, we have seen so many riots. We've seen so many cities on fire. People killing each other. And again, these are not new things, okay? This is not something new to the 21st century. We get that. But it seems to, over the last, let's just say 10 to 20 years, my lifetime, it seems to really have gotten out of hand. You're going to bring judgment on yourself if you do not place yourself under the governing authorities. Now, let me also say this. The concept here is not that God selects every individual to be appointed to public service. The idea here is that government itself, governing authorities, law and order, civil order, all of that exists because of God. He is the origin of this concept. And so does that mean he approves of everything that goes on? Well, of course not. But structure, law enforcement, all those things exist by the will of God, and we need to understand that. That's verses 1 and 2. You are either subject to that or you are resistant. And if you resist, you are going to bring upon yourself judgment. Verse 2. I find that interesting because, again, in American culture, we are taught to resist the man. As it's called, the man is what holds us down. The government, and we need to constantly march, sit in, rebel That's in, for some reason, I guess we know the reason, historically, but that's in American DNA, to be rebellious against government. Again, we were found, when we understand the history of the establishment of our country and the nature of our system of government, we understand why that's in our DNA as a country. We were established in the historical context of rebellion against oppression. One thing you're going to notice here in Romans chapter 13, Paul doesn't qualify our subjecting ourselves to government based on the form of government under which we live. He doesn't qualify it by saying monarchy or federal republic or dictatorship. He doesn't do that. He simply says, let every soul be subject to the higher powers, and if you resist the higher powers, you are resisting God, and you bring judgment upon yourself. Verses 3 through 5, here is the purpose of the governing authorities. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to evil. Do you want to be unafraid of the authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. For he, notice this here, for he, the governing authority, is God's minister. God's minister. The term minister there is diakonos, deacon, servant, attendant. That's how government is supposed to serve. To you for good. But if you do evil, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. That phrase there in verse 4 is dealing specifically with execution. The governing authorities do not bear the sword in vain. The state has the right to enforce law. Sometimes that involves capital punishment. Sometimes that involves death. And they have the God-given right, the state has the God-given right for those who are lawbreakers to put them to death. I would say, it's been a thing in our country over the last however many decades to abolish the death penalty because it's inhumane. I will say this. Good morning, Bessie. The death penalty, execution, is a deterrent to crime. And when we soften the punishments for crime, we encourage criminals. God has a very specific design and purpose for the governing authorities. Number one, we shouldn't resist it. Number two, if we do what's right, we shouldn't fear it. Number three, if we do what's wrong, we should fear it, because they exist by the will of God and they don't bear the sword in vain. And then he says again, for he is God's minister, an avenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil. Therefore, here's the conclusion. You must be subject. And that's the same word subject that's used back up in verse 1. You must place yourself under, not only because of wrath, and the wrath here is not God's wrath, it's the wrath of the civil government that we just read about in verse 4, to execute wrath on him who practices evil. So you submit yourself because of wrath, but also for conscience sake. Now, Paul's primary audience here obviously is Christians. This applies to Christians today, but it applies across the board. It doesn't matter whether a person is a Christian or not. Every human is to be subject to the governing authorities. Without governing authorities, without a governmental structure, without law, you have anarchy. You have every man for himself. You have complete chaos and disorder. And so government, governing authorities, laws, execution, death penalty, etc., those things exist for a purpose, and they are good things. That does not mean that the governing authorities always do what's right. It does not mean that governing authorities are never crooked and they're always honest. I mean, we know better than that, okay? But government as an institution exists by the will of God. We should submit ourselves to it, and we need to do what's right. Morning, David. Good morning, Jackie. Jackie Leonard says, and to your point, the death penalty is not murder. Absolutely. There is a difference between murder and killing. There's a difference between murdering someone and putting someone to death. Gail says the death penalty in this country is much more humane than the violent murders. And that's absolutely right. You think of some of the crimes that are committed in our country. And for me, as a parent, I think of crimes against children. I read a story the other day about a mother of 3 who stabbed her 3 children to death. If all the evidence comes around fairly quickly that that's what she did, she needs to die immediately. Period. I go all the way back to Genesis chapter 9. Whoever sheds man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. That is a universal, eternal principle. There's not any reformation for that type of evil. You think about, Romans 1, we looked at Romans 1, talked about those who are without natural affection. A mother of 3 stabbed her 3 children to death. Anyway, Connie says criminals do not fear prosecution anymore. So there's a Bible verse. Let me turn over to the book of Ecclesiastes real quick. I think I know right where it is. I think it's Ecclesiastes chapter 8. I think it's verse 11. Yeah. Because the sentence against an evil work is not executed speedily, therefore the heart of the sons of men is fully set in them to do evil. Listen, we want equality under the law. We want justice, equal justice for everybody. Okay? The image of Lady Justice in the United States of America, she's holding the scales and she's blindfolded. That's the concept of equal justice under the law. And evidence needs to be considered. If someone's innocent, they're innocent. They're guilty, they're guilty. And a punishment needs to be enacted. When you fail to do that, you encourage crime. That's the purpose of governing authorities, to keep order in a place that could become absolutely chaotic and criminal. Verses 6 and 7, that's why we pay taxes. And guess what? It's April 15th. What a coincidence. My taxes are already done. I don't know about you guys out there. This is another, the Boston Tea Party. Taxation without representation. A lot of people feel that way today, that we pay taxes and we're not represented. Listen, we have these rights. I shouldn't pay taxes. How many of you guys have seen this concept on Facebook? Taxation is theft. Let's read the Bible. Verse 6, for because of this, because of the existence of government, you also pay taxes, for they are God's ministers. That's the third time that governing authorities are called God's ministers, attending continually to this very thing. Render therefore to all their due taxes, to all their due. Taxes to whom taxes, and customs to whom customs, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. These taxes are the annual things. I'm just looking up these terms in the Greek language. These are the annual taxes. All right, we think of federal income tax, state tax, things like that. The customs that he's talking about here were the publicly used funds for the building of roads and things like this in the Roman Empire. Well, we have all that same stuff today. We may not agree with taxation. We may think it's, we have till May 15th. All right, well, good. We may feel, taxation is burdensome and our representatives are not representing us. It doesn't matter. To be subject to the governing authorities, number one, every soul, verse 1. Something else that's there in verse 1, it says that they, to place themselves under. Then you get to verse 2. You resist that. You resist God himself. Pay your taxes. That's it. There's no exception here. It's not fun. We don't like it. We don't like keeping up with receipts and filing things and keeping them for a certain amount of years and auditing. I heard one guy say he'd rather be mugged than audited, because when you get mugged, it happens and it's over. I thought that was pretty interesting. You're either subject or resistant. The purpose of governing authorities is to punish evil and to reward the good. And again, we understand that it doesn't always happen that way. We get that. But this is God's design. Pay your taxes. Verses 8 through 10, and it's interesting what he does here. So pay your taxes, etc. And then verse 8 starts out with, owe no man anything except to love one another. Pay your debts. Pay your obligations. I heard this verse used here, Romans 13:8, I've heard it used by people saying, well, you shouldn't get a credit card because you can't owe anybody anything, or you should only buy a car when you have all the cash to pay for it. Well, listen, if you set up an installment plan and you make your payments, you owe no man anything. If you're in debt, but you're meeting your debts on a scheduled basis, you don't owe anybody anything. You've made that agreement. Now keep your agreement. Owe no man anything but to love one another, for he who loves another has fulfilled the law. And then he quotes from Exodus 20, Deuteronomy 5, the 10 Commandments, these things. All of these commandments, he says, are summed up in this one. That is, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. In the broader context of governing authorities, it's this: living in civil society. If you say you're going to pay someone something, pay them. Don't be dishonest. Don't be a thief. And that's the thing. If you make an agreement to pay something and you don't pay it, and you have that something, you're a thief. You're stealing from someone. Pay your debts. Meet your obligations. All right? Treat people as you want to be treated. I think that's somewhere in the Bible. Love does no harm to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law. Not only of the old law, but also of the new law. I mean, Jesus reiterates this commandment in Matthew chapter 22. The two great commandments, love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself. Everything hangs on those two. In other words, every other commandment falls under one of those two. Love God, love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no harm. Verses 11 to 14, we've got to cast some things off and put some things on. And do this, that is, loving each other, knowing the time, that now it is high time to awake out of sleep, for now our salvation is nearer than when we first believed. And that's true for all of us. You know, every day we live, we are one day closer to death. And if I'm a Christian, every day I live, I'm one day further away from the time I obeyed the gospel. And so I should be prepared for today and for the next day. And ultimately, of course, for standing before God in judgment. The night is far spent, the day is at hand. Therefore, what do? Well, you got to cast off the works of darkness and put on the armor of light. Let us walk properly, that is, honorably. The Greek word means to be honorable or decent. There are a lot of decent people in the world, but we also know there are some very indecent and evil people in the world. Our obligation as a Christian is to be proper, as in the day, not in revelry and drunkenness, not in lewdness and lust, not in strife and envy. Everything prior to Romans 13 and verse 13 is the opposite of those things. You're subject to authority. You do what's right, and so you don't fear the government. You pay your taxes. You love one another. This is what the Christian does. You put these things on. And put on the Lord Jesus Christ, verse 14, and make no provision for the flesh to fulfill it in its lust. Provision. This word is used twice in the New Testament. The other time is in Acts 24, maybe verse 15. But this is that idea of providence, to think ahead about something. You don't make thinking ahead plans to fulfill the lust of the flesh. You've put that stuff off. You've put on Christ. You're walking in the light. You're walking in the day. You're an honorable, decent person. And so do what's right. Cast off and put on. That's Romans chapter 13, guys. Pretty straightforward stuff. Governing authorities. It's universal. We know its origin. We put ourselves on. And here's the thing. I've got a note written here in the margin of my Bible. Think about this. Paul was not writing to a federal republic that was governed by a constitution with a Bill of Rights. He was dealing with people who, a citizenry who 30 to 40% of the Roman population in the first century was under slavery. Paul doesn't tell them to buck the system. He doesn't tell them to organize sit-ins and marches and demand your rights. He says, put yourself under the governing authorities, verses 1 and 2. Do what is right, verse 3. Pay your taxes, verses 6 and 7. And treat everybody like you want to be treated, verses 8 through 14. It doesn't matter what period of history you live in, or what form of government you live under, or whether or not you agree or disagree with taxation principles. You are a Christian, and so you do what God says regardless. There's no exemption. That's the word. I think that's the word I was looking for. No Christian's exempt from this. So act like it. All right, guys, that's what I've got. Hey, Uncle Paul, good to see you up there in Mount Vernon, Ohio. Okay, guys, appreciate everybody joining in today. Had a good number on the live stream. Appreciate the comments. As always, after the live stream is over, you can still access the comments section. And Mark says he desires us to live peaceable. Paul talks about that also to Timothy. Read 1 Timothy 2, verses 1 through 4, where he says, I want prayers to be offered for all, that we may live a quiet and peaceable life in all godliness. Peter talks about it in 1 Peter 2, verses 13 through 17. Jesus tells us to pay our taxes. Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. And that's what Diana, your comment just came up. Just as Jesus did, give Caesar. Yeah, that's what we're called to do. All right, guys, I hope you have a good weekend. We'll be live here at Mammoth Spring Church of Christ Sunday morning at 10 a.m. for our services. This Sunday, I'm going to take a break from. I've been working my way through the book of Acts, talking about the church that acts like the church in Acts. We're taking a break from that, and this Sunday we're going to talk about what it means to bring up children. This church here is blessed with a lot of young couples and children. We've got some, 4 or 5 babies in our audience. So that's what we're going to talk about Sunday here at Mammoth Spring. If you're unable to get out Sunday, join us here on the live stream at 10 a.m. Central Time, and hopefully it'll be a benefit to you. All right, guys, have a good day. Have a good weekend, and Lord willing, we'll see you back here Monday at 11 a.m. for Romans chapter 14.